This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, welcome to module number 3 of CS5970 on AI, ethics, and geoethics. My name is Imme Ebert-Uphoff, and I'm a guest lecturer for this. So let me share my screen. All right. So now you can all hopefully see my screen here. Okay, so the topic of this module is enabling interdisciplinary research. And again, my name is Imme Ebert-Uphoff, and you can see my email address here, and I am at Colorado State University. Before we jump into the topic, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background. So I'm a research professor in electrical and computer engineering at CSU, as well as the machine learning lead at the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere. And I'm also co-PI of the NSF AI Institute for Research on Trustworthy AI and Weather, Climate, and Coastal Oceanography, also known as AI2S, which I'm sure you've heard much about because Amy McGovern is the director of this institute. Just to be perfectly clear, I am not an expert in interdisciplinary studies or science of team science. Instead, the discussion here is based on my experience. So I'm not a researcher in this area, but I've used these techniques a lot. So this discussion is based on 10+ years of experience of performing research at the intersection of data science and climate and weather. And also, I've been reading relevant literature in interdisciplinary science and team science on the way to make my collaborations as efficient and as fun as possible. So that's my background. You will find that a few of the examples that I give in the following are because of my background on specifically merging the disciplines of data science or AI and earth science, simply because that's where I experience interdisciplinary collaborations, and that's why I can give better examples there than elsewhere. But those examples generalize easily, and most of the material discussed here is not specific to these disciplines. All right, so this is an AI and ethics class. Why do we even talk about interdisciplinary research in this class? Take a moment and reflect. Why would interdisciplinary research be important for AI and ethics? So here are some of my answers. Is simply, first of all, AI and ethics are two different disciplines. So if you want to combine the two, you have to deal with interdisciplinary collaboration. More importantly, many societal problems cannot be solved within a single discipline. These are often called wicked problems. They're very complex. They require many people from many different disciplines to work together. And ethics and AI is a perfect example of that. A single discipline, such as computer science, does not provide all the expertise to understand all the consequences of deploying AI in society. So you need to have viewpoints and expertise from several other disciplines as well, which means responsible AI really needs interdisciplinary teams. But the key point is that interdisciplinary collaboration actually has many challenges. So two big challenges I have on this slide. Challenge one is really bridging disciplines. Clearly, even if you only have two people from different disciplines, they have to bridge their disciplines, and that's not so easy. And there's a whole field on this topic. It's called interdisciplinary studies, and it's shown here on the left side, and we'll discuss that first. And the other challenge is simply when you have interdisciplinary collaboration, your team size quickly grows. So then teams become large, and just working effectively across large and also geographically and otherwise diverse teams is tricky. So the science of team science helps us there to make progress. So as I said, the first topic that we look at is interdisciplinary studies and what we can learn from that. And then after that, we talk about science of team science and some insights from that. So first, some vocabulary. You've probably heard many different terms like multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, etc. And I just wanted to go through those so that we all have the same understanding. First of all, they're not used completely consistently across literature, but most people use them in the following way. Basically, you have different ways to solve a task that spans more than one discipline. And you can interpret each small circle over here in this graph as an individual discipline or as a single person, but each one from a different discipline. So either you have all these different disciplines and several people for each, or maybe you only have one person for each, and each circle is really one person representing one discipline. And any new collaboration starts towards the left side. So you're starting with just one discipline, so you call it interdisciplinary if all the people are working just in one discipline. And then the level of integration goes from the left to the right. So specifically, interdisciplinary usually means it involves only one discipline. Cross-disciplinary usually means it involves more than one discipline, but the tasks are really split. So there's separate subtasks in different disciplines, and you just divide them out to different people in different disciplines. They're not truly working together on this. They're just generating different components. Multidisciplinary is when you already start to combine separate perspectives under, for example, one theme. And people start to talk more to each other, and there's more collaboration across disciplines. But when you get to interdisciplinary, that's where it gets really interesting, because you see these circles now have merged together, or they're large intersections, which means people have really crossed the boundaries of their disciplines. So this combines separate perspectives for the development of connections between them. And so in this case, the subtasks are not split into separate disciplines that everybody can do by themselves, but people solve the problems together. So they really have to bridge their differences, and we get to that in a second. And then finally, transdisciplinary is when you've really bridged it and you pretty much created a new discipline. And a common example of that is bioinformatics. It started out as just biology, and then people with biology and computer science got together. And then they moved further and further to the right until it became a discipline of its own. And now you can get a degree in bioinformatics. So of course you can have the whole cycle start over and combine bioinformatics with something else. All right, as I mentioned before, interdisciplinary studies is actually its own discipline. And here, citing from this book on interdisciplinary research, the goal of interdisciplinary science is to draw on disciplines to integrate their insights. And integration literally means to make whole. And integration is the process by which ideas, data and information, methods, tools, concepts, and/or theories from two or more disciplines are synthesized, connected, or blended. So if you want to know more about interdisciplinary studies in general, I encourage you to visit the website Association for Interdisciplinary Studies, or known as AIS, at this location, to learn about IDS conferences, degree programs, teaching resources. They have all kinds of interesting material. All right, so we know we want to synthesize, connect, and blend data and information, methods, tools, concepts, and/or theories from two or more disciplines. How do we do that? So we're going to discuss just two strategies here. The first one is you have to choose your team wisely and foster certain skills, specifically interdisciplinary habits of the mind. The second one that we'll discuss is techniques to identify and strengthen connections between team members and the topics, and to establish a common vision. And the main tool we're going to be discussing is co-creating boundary objects. So first, let's just start with the first topic: choosing your time wisely and fostering certain skills. So to choose your team wisely and foster certain skills, it's very useful to know interdisciplinary habits of the mind, which we'll get to in a second. So first, you should learn what they are. Then you should foster these skills in yourself and lead by example. You foster these skills in your team or teammates. And you also look for these skills when choosing collaborators or teammates for a class project or whatever. You may also want to learn from past collaborations, look back and analyze what worked and what didn't, and why, and what was missing. And even if you look back at partners you've had in the past class projects, for example, you may learn what worked well and what didn't, and kind of learn how to do better in the future. So here's a subset of the interdisciplinary habits of the mind, and here's a full citation, and this is actually going to be a required reading. So I'm going to have you read this whole paper, but here are just some of my favorites that I took from there. So some important habits are to set aside personal convictions. You really have to come to the table very open-minded and not come in there thinking you already know the solution. You also have to strive for a feel of each discipline's perspective. You can't just stay in your own corner and say, I'm a computer scientist, I'm just only going to think about computer science stuff. You again have to be open-minded and try to get a feel for the other discipline. How does it work? What kind of culture is there? How do people think? Try to embrace contradictions. Quite often, things may seem like contradictions, but they aren't. So you can ask yourself, how can it be both? Look for examined linkages and unexpected effects. Strive for balance among disciplinary perspectives. Kind of keep a track of somebody, if one area is represented very well and the other one is barely discussed, that's probably not a good way. So kind of keep track of how much you integrate the different disciplines and strive for balance. And the last two are my absolute favorites. So one is don't fall in love with the solution until you understand the full complexity of the problem. I'm guilty of that sometimes. I think right away, oh, this is how you solve this problem. You use this machine learning method. But then I realized I didn't really fully understand the complexity of the problem. And so just hold back and just try to really listen first, understand the full complexity of the problem before you even think of solutions. And lastly, value intellectual flexibility and playfulness. If you pick teammates that also value intellectual flexibility and playfulness, you're guaranteed to have a fun experience. Some helpful personality qualities and personal qualities and skills. You can find them in more detail in this paper. If you want to do interdisciplinary collaboration, you better make sure that you and your partners have good communication skills and organizational skills. You also are better off if you have a broad interest, flexibility, creativity, and openness, tolerance for ambiguity, and again, transcendence of disciplines. You have to be willing to really invest some time and learn about the terminology, but also the ways of thinking and philosophy of other disciplines. Very important is respect toward different people, perspectives, and cultures. And scientific skills for gathering, translating, analyzing, structuring, weighting, and valuing, and synthesizing knowledge and information, because you will have so many different viewpoints coming together. It's really important to be able to organize all that. And we get to some of those tools later. All right, coming to the second strategy, specific techniques to identify and strengthen connections between team members and their topics and to establish a common vision. So one of the key techniques is to co-create boundary objects. And boundary objects is really short for boundary crossing objects. So you want to create some objects together that cross the disciplinary boundaries between you. And I'm going to give you just two examples here that we'll look at in a little bit more detail. One is the interview method, which we get to in a second, and the second one is concept maps. And of course, many other methods exist, but these are my preferred ones so far. So let's start with the interview method. I first want to introduce you to two people, Peter and Andrea. One is a data scientist, the other is a climate scientist. Guess which one is which? Well, you probably guessed it. Peter is a climate scientist and Andrea is a data scientist. So you can see Peter here is in deep thought about climate, and Andrea is just enjoying looking at some data and trying to find some patterns in the data. Now, Peter and Andrea have met somewhere, maybe at a conference, maybe a friend introduced them, maybe they just are in the same building and ran into each other at the coffee machine, but they decided they want to learn to work more closely together. So first, Peter and Andrea use the interview method, and it works as follows. Let's say Andrea starts interviewing Peter. So Andrea says to Peter, Peter, tell me all the basics about your problem, but please do it in plain English. No jargon from your discipline, please. Because again, Andrea is a data scientist and Peter is a climate scientist. Then while Peter starts talking, Andrea takes notes. After the meeting, Andrea types them up, and then she sends them to Peter for checking. Peter looks at Andrea's notes and sends back corrections. What you have now, as simple as this process was, is that you have a document about the problem in a language that both understand and agree on. So they co-created their first boundary crossing object in a shared language and also achieved consensus. This is quite different from if Peter would have just gone ahead and typed up his own problem, because there wouldn't have been any check for understanding built in. There wouldn't have been learning taking place, and there wouldn't have been any knowledge integration and no crossing boundaries, because it's just Peter talking about his own topic, basically to himself, and then handing it over to Andrea. By having Andrea take the notes and really rephrase it in her own words, and the two of them going back and forth until they get it right, they learn a lot from each other. So what you do in this process, which can be very quick, and on which we plan to have an exercise in this class, is to build common understanding of the problem, which is really important, and also learning about each other's language. So this interview process nicely sets the stage for the entire collaboration. It shows that both parties want to understand and learn about the discipline of the other. And by the way, after Andrea interviewed Peter, of course, you are then reverse the whole process, and Peter's going to interview Andrea and types up his notes and sends them to Andrea, and they go back and forth. So you have to do it in both directions. After that process is done, you really know that both parties are willing to understand and learn about the other discipline and invest in that. Both parties are willing to spend time explaining and listening. And both parties can communicate their own topics in plain English. So 2 comments on this whole process. Number 1, how strictly you follow this process depends on how far apart the parties are and how well they communicate anyway. You might not have to type anything up. Maybe just Andrea repeats something verbally. Maybe they already understand each other well enough that this process works. So that's totally up to you. But what's really key is that this is an amazing early test. If one party is not willing or able to participate in this process, it might be much better for you to just walk away from this collaboration. Now, don't decide on the first meeting, because sometimes it just takes some time to get the communication going. But if after several meetings you still have the feeling you don't understand each other, or the other person isn't willing to listen, or the other person isn't able to explain their topics in a language that you can understand, even if your topics are the greatest match, the collaboration is not going to work because you don't speak the same language. And maybe somebody isn't open enough to really listen. So this kind of process is really good early on to check whether you're actually a good match. All right. A second boundary crossing concept is concept maps. So concept maps are commonly used in teaching. So a student is given a topic, then the student selects the most important concepts in the topic and then draws each concept in either an oval or a rectangle, and then draws arrows connecting the different concepts, and optionally labels arrows with descriptions or relationships. And in teaching, that's often used before and after topic is taught to see how the student's understanding has improved of how these different concepts connect. For collaborations, though, you create these maps in teams to link concepts from both disciplines. So just imagine one person draws concepts on one side and another person draws concepts on the other side. You want to link them both together. You draw a concept map and you then identify connections between disciplines and organize also the collaboration. Here's just a quick example. This one is an undirected one, so the connections here actually don't have arrowheads. That's a question of taste, as I say here on the right. So here the edges don't have directions. Whether you direct edges or not is up to you. That totally depends on the topic and whatever works best. I usually draw them with edges, but this was just a very nice example without them. What's interesting here is you see on the basically 3 different disciplines here. You see on or it's 3 types of concepts. On the left side, this is all about climate change. And on the left side, you see different causes of climate change. So it all connects here. And on the top, you see negative impacts. And on the bottom, you see positive impacts, which, believe it or not, also may exist, but of course, they're much smaller. And you see that there are a whole lot of different disciplines represented, right? Because, you know, from carbon emission to health problems, whether people get headaches, skin cancer, and sunburn, these are all concepts that come from very different disciplines, but nevertheless, they're all connected in one single concept map. Excuse me. There aren't too many cross connections here, so things are still a little isolated. So this is probably more at the beginning of the collaboration, where you're kind of at the multidisciplinary step, and you get later to the interdisciplinary stages, right? So why are co-developed concept maps so useful? There are several key points. First of all, each person communicates the most important topics in their relationships. So even for that single person, that forces them to distill the key concepts in relationships and distill it down to the minimum so that they can explain it. The other person is forced to understand those concepts drawn by the first person before they can do anything with the diagram. So this already forces learning and also forces crossing boundaries. And then when folks from different disciplines integrate their maps, so they start drawing connections between the different concepts, it forces them to establish new connections between the different disciplines. And that's really where synthesis, blending, and convergence happens. That's how common vision is established, and also helps to organize a collaboration because you see where you're going to interface and how. Here's some great references. So Deanna Pennington and her team, for example, the Embers project, they were tracking how model-based reasoning helps in social environmental synthesis. So they used boundary objects like concept maps. And then here's your reference on concept mapping if you want to learn more about concept mapping. So concept maps are also a great tool for large teams. The whole process of creating a concept map together provides all participants with ownership. It helps build a common vision, and helps for clear communication of that vision to all team members. And you basically tune it until all team members are happy with it. So that's really the first step to develop a research plan and action items. And usually the first concept map is really rough. It's just the start, and the map might be revised many times over often years of collaboration. And it's often even a tool that you can keep track of the changing concept maps to see how your group's vision evolved over time and what was learned. So do keep the early concept maps if you have a long-term collaboration. Just a quick case study of interdisciplinary collaboration. Back to Pete and Andrea. Let's follow them through different phases of their collaboration. And the topic of this case study, as I mentioned before, is collaboration between an earth scientist and a data scientist, or instead of a data scientist, you could say an AI scientist to make it at least a little bit closer to your course. And apologies to those who are not interested in climate science. I hope you can generalize from this example to other disciplines, for example, collaboration of folks in AI and ethics. All right, so often there's a phase one. You know, Pete and Andrea just met, they just did their first interviews, and now they have to figure out what kind of problems specifically they want to work on, what are the scientific questions in this case, and on the AI side, what is the algorithm selection, and they're going to have lots of discussion. And just keep in mind that only Peter, in this case, the climate scientist, has a real understanding of the physical processes, what is already known, what is important, the available data sets, the required temporal and spatial resolution, all that goes into here. On the other hand, only Andrea understands the machine learning methods, what we can expect to achieve, how many samples are needed, the computation effort, the likely pitfalls like overfitting and so forth. So that's why it really has to go in many iterations, because together they have to figure out what is a feasible problem that they can address in climate science with AI-like techniques. So they have to discuss together the selection of the problem, the questions, and the approach, and the data set. Can't do it alone. Phase two, maybe you start doing experiments, you have your data set, you start figuring out pre-processing, which again, only Peter knows which type of interpolation to use, what kind of smoothing there should be applied, should be normalize the data, which geographical area should be focused on, and should be only use certain seasons, and all these kind of factors. And so you start pre-processing to expose strong signals in the data. You start playing around with different machine learning algorithms. Maybe you visualize the results, hopefully. Then you bring it back and see, do the results make physical sense? And if not, then you start debugging. What went wrong? Was it a problem with the data? Was it a problem with the algorithm? Are we asking the right questions? Are we using the right tool? And you go on many iterations. And the whole point is just, you see how strongly they have to talk to each other. If one of them just walks off to their office and doesn't talk to the other for 3 months, you can be certain that both of them go off in the wrong direction and overlook something. They can only solve the problem together. It's really interlaced. So you do this iteration until the results actually make physical sense, and then you go into the evaluation phase. So in phase 3, You think the results appear to be physically meaningful, but are the results robust? Can we verify the results by other means? For example, simulation model can be, if you have a hypothesis of a mechanism, can be simulated and see whether that mechanism actually works this way. And did we really answer the original question? We visualize results and do interpretation. But the key point, and the one that probably generalizes the most from this side, is you have to communicate the results back to the community, and you have to translate all the results back into, in this case, a climate language. But for example, if it's ethics and AI, you have to bring your results back into, okay, what is the impact on the deploying this type of artificial intelligence to a community? So you always have to make sure when you start with your original question, which may have been, what is the impact of AI on your community? You have to make sure that at the end you bring it back to this. All right. Key observations. And again, this is general to any kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. I hope I made it clear that many tasks cannot be split into two separate parts that each person works on independently. They have to work together. Many decisions must be made together, requiring both of their special knowledge. Therefore, Peter and Andrea cannot stay completely on their own side. Each person needs to have at least a basic understanding of the thinking process of the other person. Each person must be willing to teach and learn some vocabulary and tools, and constant feedback from both sides is essential. You have to talk to each other, talk, and then talk some more. And meanwhile, you won't be separated anymore. You know, Andrea will get a little bit of an area of Peter's discipline, and Peter will get a little bit of an idea of Andrea's discipline over time. All right. So that covers really the topic of bridging disciplines. At least it covered some of the strategies you can use. Now let's go to topic number 2. Challenge number 2 is working effectively across large teams, and it's even harder if they're large and diverse. So there are just some insights here, selected insights from the science of team science. Again, keep in mind, I'm not an expert on science of team science. I can only tell you about the tools that I've learned from science of team science people, because we have science of team science people here at Colorado State University who often help us do our research and work better together. So insights from the science of team science. And this is actually adapted from a blog post by Jennifer Cross and Hannah Love, who are actually 2 science of team science researchers here at CSU. And here's the source. So feel free to go to the blog post to see more. So many factors that determine team performance can be learned. For example, team creativity and innovation can be increased by improving your group membership. By that we mean increased diversity. That means increase the number of members that have different knowledge, different skills, and different background. It also, and this is, they actually showed that in studies, you can also improve your creativity and innovation of your team by increasing the proportion of women. So a funny fact though is that it only works to a certain point. So if you start with an all-male team, that usually doesn't work as well. If you start introducing women, that gets better and better. But then if you hit a lot more than 50% and say you go to an all-women team, that doesn't work so well either. And a funny little fact is that an all-women team tends to work a little better than an all-male team, but the best of all worlds is really to have a combination of men and women. So we really need them both, which is a great insight to have. Okay, secondly, you can improve what people call collective intelligence, also known as the C factor, to emphasize and practice even turn-taking, for example, in social sensitivity. So you can practice these things. You can have a third-party facilitator who helps you doing that. Interestingly enough, your C factor tends to improve automatically when more women are included. That's probably because of social sensitivity of women, but generally speaking, of course, that's generally, you can't just put in a woman and expect things to get better, but generally speaking, if you have an all-male team and you put in a few women, it usually improves the C factor, and thus improves team creativity and innovation. You can also improve patterns of interaction, and often it's very useful to have third-party facilitators. We often bring in Jennifer Cross and her team from IRIS at CSU to help us with large collaborations. And you can use writing techniques for idea generation. For example, one of my favorites is Padlets. When it comes to decision making, there are many different leadership styles. Probably the dominant overall style in the US by now is the participatory leadership style. But there are very many different levels of participation. So participatory leadership style just means that the team lead makes sure that the subordinates or the team members participate in the decision making. But the level of participation varies greatly. So if you look at the spectrum over here, which comes from this little article here, you can go from no participation all the way to high participation. So the no participation and the decision is made by the leader, and that's not really participatory. But a little bit more participatory is if the leader introduces a decision, a problem, gathers feedback, but then the leader makes a decision again. The next step is that the subordinates or team members provide ideas regarding the decision, but again, the leader makes a final decision. The next step is consensus style, which means the decision is made together with the leader and the team members. So in this case, the team members really have a big say in how the decision is actually formed at the end and the actual decision making. And then in even more extreme cases, when the leader delegates the decision making fully to the subordinates. Just says, here you go, you make the decision, tell me at the end. And one really good style is the one where the decisions are made together with the leader and subordinates. And that's often called a consensus style. And we get more into this in the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about consensus decision making. So here's a great guide, which I also have you read. I will provide that in the required reading list for this module. The key points here are that you're truly committed to finding solutions that everyone actively supports or at least can live with. The whole group has to work hard to find win-win solutions that address everyone's needs. And so the top tips to actually make this work is that consensus is about cooperation between equals. So you have to start out treating everybody as equals. And once you put these values in practice, that will be the key to making consensus work. Another key tip is to explore your differences. So people often shy away from conflict or get into arguments to prove they're right. However, the key to finding win-win solutions is to understand all the different needs and perspectives before forming a proposal. So you start by explaining what the decision is all about and what the options are, and then you first let the team members all express what they think about it, what they like about different options or don't like. And then you go ahead and you try to synthesize from the different comments a solution that really works for everybody. So usually in that process, you generate new options and new solutions. And lastly, you have to be very clear when you make a decision so that everyone goes away with a shared understanding of what has been agreed upon. You'd be surprised how often people go away from something like this and they all think they know exactly what was decided, but they're surprised later. So before finalizing a decision, test to check there really is agreement and everybody knows what they just agreed to. The key advantages of consensus model for decision making is that it enables the group to share power, trust, and understanding. You also tend to make better decisions because you're weaving together all the best ideas and address all the key concerns to find something that works for everyone, which is typically a much better solution. Sometimes a surprising and creative solution, but it's usually a much better one than any team member could have come up with on their own. But my key point in the context of this course is especially that consensus protects minority needs and opinions. So the last point is really key because it guarantees that minority viewpoints are guaranteed to be taken into account if you have any minority members on the team. In contrast, I have so often experienced less participatory decision-making models. And so sometimes, a team brings in minorities to get their viewpoint, but the minority people tend to be junior. They could be a different skin color, they could be a different gender, they could be, anything. But they tend to be junior in most cases. And in a less participatory model, at the end, the decisions are often made by the leader, right? With the minorities' needs, again, ignored or outvoted. And it's often not on purpose. The leader often thinks, oh, I understood what the minority was saying, but sometimes they didn't. And so the key point is that if you truly use the consensus decision-making model, if then you bring in any minority view, you are guaranteed that that view will be taken into account, that you will not ignore that solution. Or if you take any of the less participatory decision-making models, it happens so easily that at the end you overlooked it again. So it's really important for teams to have a discussion early on about the leadership model to be used for decision-making, and to really agree on which one you use. And I hope that many of you can use consensus. It takes extra effort, but it usually gives better results. And it also makes you a much happier team because you feel more equal and you know that your opinion will always be valued and taken into account. So I'm all for consensus decision making, and that, as Dr. McGovern may have told you, is also the model that we agreed on for the whole AI Institute. And we're very, very happy with that. All right, how does the decision making actually work? If you want to generate consensus in a large group, how do you do that? First of all, the best way to create a good idea is to create lots of ideas. And so usually what you do is you just describe the issue, for example, the decision that has to be made or the problem that has to be solved. And then first you diverge. You basically generate lots of ideas, and people are going to maybe even move further apart from each other in the ideas they have, but that way you generate a really broad set of ideas. And you explore it together in a group, and you go all the distance over here. And then at some point you start to do convergence, where you try to bring the different ideas together and bring the best ideas of them to merge them into one solution. And that's a convergence state, which then results in a decision or in a solution. So you'll see the term convergence actually a lot. It's something that the National Science Foundation is very keen on, that the teams provide convergence. You hear people talk a lot less about divergence, but you have to be really careful. When you start with the issue, don't jump right to convergence because you're not going to come up with the best solution. You really have to take some time first to diverge. And then after a little while, after you explored some ideas and you feel like, okay, I'm not adding a lot of new things here anymore as a team, then you start to come together and really converge to one decision. Okay. Lastly, I wanted to discuss some additional roadblocks in addition to crossing boundaries and managing large teams for interdisciplinary collaboration to be aware of and navigate consciously. For students, if you're working at the intersection of two different disciplines, you may ask yourself, where do I publish work that crosses disciplinary boundaries? What will my committee think? Where will I get a job afterwards if I don't do the classic computer science task? And I've seen that especially because I've been involved for almost 10 years in the whole climate informatics workshop series, where we try to bring together people who use machine learning and climate science. And at the beginning, this was really hard. First of all, you had to bring people together to speak the same language. But then once we had the first students graduate who really crossed the boundaries, we started to see, wait a second, they're not getting jobs because the companies weren't ready to really hire people who were at the disciplinary boundary. Do you apply for a computer science job or do you apply for a climate science job? So it was tricky for a while, and now these people, everybody wants these people because everybody knows by now that machine learning is really important for climate science. But that wasn't the case for quite some time. So if you're branching out and you're working in a cross-disciplinary area, you need to think about those questions and talk to your advisor about them before you really engage in the work, because you really have to figure out where you can publish work. If you do it at the intersection of computer science and ethics, are you going to publish in computer science or in ethics? Or is there a conference on computer science and ethics? What will your committee think about it? Are they totally on board with you being so cross-disciplinary? And again, where will you get a job, right? So these are just things, you can navigate them, but you should be very aware of those. For faculty, there are even more, because the first question is, as a faculty member, where do I get funding for this interdisciplinary work? My work might not fit any of the classic topics. There used to be more funding, there used to be funding mainly on climate science and in computer science. But if you wanted to do machine learning for climate science, the computer scientists will usually tell you, the NSF department, computer science would often tell you, well, you're not inventing new algorithms, so no, we don't fund this. And the climate science department might tell you, well, you're mainly working on methods and adjusting them here, that's just not really climate science. We don't fund you either. And again, we've come a long way in that area. So for example, the AI Institute is living proof of the fact that now funding agencies are realizing that machine learning and climate science and weather science really go together, and that you should fund interdisciplinary research to make progress. But that wasn't always the case. So whenever you start merging two different topics that are quite different disciplines, you have to think as a faculty member where you're going to get funding. You also have to think about whether your colleagues and departments value your work in this non-traditional area. Is it going to cause problems for promotion and tenure? In fact, I saw many people only starting this interdisciplinary research after they got tenure, because then you have a lot more freedom. You don't have to worry about your committee that much. Same question as for students. Where do I publish? How do I recruit students or postdocs who can do this kind of work? It's really hard to find people who know something about atmospheric science and machine learning. So most often you pick somebody from one of those two disciplines and train them. And the best way to train them is usually a cohort model, where you have one research lab where you have some computer science and some atmospheric science, or some AI scientist and an ethics person. So cohorts really work well and are one of the most efficient models to get conversations going and to make sure that students get educated in both areas and talk to each other. Then other problems between collaborators: how do you find publishing venues that are good for both of us if we're both in different disciplines? How do we adopt to the different publishing models across areas? For example, in computer science, you have all these really competitive conferences where you have to publish a few papers there to show that you can make it in this competitive environment. While in climate science, you only publish abstracts, and they pretty much all get accepted at conferences. You don't submit papers to conferences. So you have to learn all these things early on, the different cultures in the different environments, and figure out how you're going to navigate this. So the bad news is many roadblocks still exist. There's still a computer science department and an atmospheric science department and a social science department. They're still separate. But the good news is that it's getting much easier every year. And that is largely because funding agencies are seeing that interdisciplinary collaboration is really important in order to solve many societal problems. And if the funding agencies see that and fund it, then the universities and the professional communities are starting to support it. The universities definitely, because if they want their people to get funding, well, they have to go by the trends of the funding agencies. So everybody is beginning to accept and even encourage it more. And again, I think a living example of that, living proof, is the AI Institute. 5 years ago, we would have dreamed about something like this, but now the NSF is funding an AI Institute for weather, climate, and coastal oceanography for machine learning. So that's pretty cool. So things are moving forward. So that's it for today, or for this module. We will have additional reading assignments, and we also will have some exercises for you. Thank you for listening. I very much look forward to our discussions on the topic. I will see you in the Slack channel, and I'm also looking forward to hearing about your projects. With that, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you on Slack. Oh, and by the way, it's just that I'm recording this in the evening. This is Colorado in the evening. It's dark, and that's why my window is dark. Bye.